In the summer of 1986, at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands, Margaret Thatcher arrived for the annual prime ministerial weekend. It was a tradition every sitting prime minister endured, a ritual of walks, picnics and barbecues, in which the Queen assessed the character of the person running her government. Thatcher, by all accounts documented in Charles Moore's authorised biography, arrived in heels and a skirt suit. The Queen wore tweeds and Wellington boots. When Thatcher attempted to help wash the dishes after a picnic, a task the Queen performed herself, an old wartime habit she never dropped, Elizabeth said nothing to correct her. She simply continued washing. Thatcher, uncertain, stood holding a tea towel. A lady-in-waiting later told Moore that the silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Thatcher dried exactly one plate and then stopped. The Queen did not look up. She did not need to. The message had been delivered without a single word spoken aloud. And Margaret Thatcher, a woman famous for bending entire cabinets to her will through sheer vocal force, understood it completely. That small moment at a Scottish sink captures something essential about Elizabeth II that the public rarely understood and her inner circle never forgot. She reigned for 70 years, from the age of 25 until her death at 96. And across 7 decades of documented interactions with prime ministers, foreign heads of state, family members, staff and strangers, there is no credible account of her ever raising her voice. Not once. Not during the abdication crisis that destroyed her childhood. Not during the collapse of her children's marriages. Not during the public fury that followed Princess Diana's death in 1997. Not during the slow unravelling of Prince Andrew's reputation decades later. Her biographers, Ben Pimlott, Robert Lacey, Sally Bedell-Smith, Robert Hardman, all searched for the moment she broke composure, and none of them found it. This was not, as some assumed, because she lacked strong opinions. It was because she had learned from the age of 10 that silence was a weapon, and she wielded it with a precision that most people only recognized after the damage was done. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born on April 21, 1926, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York. She was not expected to be queen. Her uncle, Edward VIII, held the throne, and the assumption was that he would marry, produce heirs, and the York branch would fade into comfortable irrelevance. That assumption collapsed on December 11, 1936, when Edward abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Elizabeth was 10 years old. Her father, a man with a debilitating stammer who had never wanted the crown, became George VI overnight. Marion Crawford, Elizabeth's governess, known as Crawfie, later wrote in her memoir, The Little Princesses, that on the day the abdication was announced, Elizabeth asked her mother, "Does that mean you will be queen?" Her mother replied, "Yes, I suppose it does." Elizabeth said nothing further. Crawfie noted this silence specifically because it struck her as unusual for a child of 10. Most children would have asked more questions. Elizabeth simply absorbed the information. She was already learning the central lesson of her life, that the most dangerous words are the ones you speak out loud. She was trained for the role by her father, who understood from bitter experience what happened when a monarch let emotion override duty. George VI, according to his official biographer John Wheeler Bennett, told his eldest daughter that a sovereign's job was to be a mirror in which the nation saw itself, not a window through which the nation saw the sovereign. Elizabeth internalized this completely. By the time she ascended the throne on February 6, 1952, following her father's death from lung cancer at the age of 56, she had already spent 15 years practicing the art of strategic composure. She was 25. Winston Churchill, her first Prime Minister, was 77. He wept during their first audience. She did not. The weekly audience between the monarch and the Prime Minister is one of the most closely guarded rituals in British political life. No minutes are taken, no aides are present. What is known comes from what Prime Ministers later disclosed, often decades after leaving office, in memoirs or authorised biographies. These accounts reveal a consistent pattern. In 1955, during one of Anthony Eden's early audiences at Buckingham Palace, the new Prime Minister, who had waited years in Churchill's shadow and was eager to assert himself, arrived with a prepared briefing on the Suez situation. Eden, according to Robert Rhodes James's biography, began to outline his position. The Queen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked a single question about troop logistics that Eden could not answer. He left the audience, according to his private secretary, Evelyn Shuckburgh, visibly unsettled. Shuckburgh recorded in his published diary that Eden said the Queen knew more than I expected. The question itself was not hostile. The tone, Eden noted, was perfectly polite, but the effect was devastating precisely because it was quiet. A shouted challenge can be dismissed as emotion. A calm, specific question that exposes a gap in preparation cannot. That was the method, and it never changed. Harold Wilson, who served as Prime Minister from 1964 to 1970, and again from 1974 to 1976, reportedly enjoyed his audiences with the Queen more than any other Premier. Ben Pimlott, in his biography of Wilson, records that the Labour leader once told his press secretary, Joe Haynes, that the Queen is the only person in the world I can talk to without worrying about what gets reported. But even Wilson, who genuinely liked her, noticed the silences. In 1968, during a discussion about Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence, Wilson presented a position the Queen found questionable. She did not argue. She said, according to Pimlott's account drawn from Wilson's own recollections, "How interesting." Wilson told Haynes afterward that when the Queen said, "How interesting," it meant she disagreed entirely. The phrase became a kind of code among Downing Street staff. If the Queen found something interesting, it meant the opposite of what the word suggested. It meant she had weighed the argument and found it insufficient, and she was giving you exactly one chance to reconsider before she stopped engaging altogether. Within the royal household, the mechanism was even more refined. Robert Hardman, in his 2018 book Queen of the World, records an incident from the early 1990s in which a new equerry, a military officer assigned to the Queen's personal staff, committed the error of placing a guest at the wrong seat during an official dinner. The equerry realised his mistake partway through the first course. The Queen, seated at the head of the table, noticed immediately. She did not correct him publicly. She did not summon him. She simply looked at the equerry, held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then returned to her conversation. The equerry later told Hardman that the look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. He described it as the most effective reprimand he had ever received in 20 years of military service, including 2 deployments. The following morning, his correction came through the private secretary's office, a quiet note about protocol. The Queen never mentioned it again. She did not need to. The 3-second look had done the work of a 20-minute dressing down. The pattern extended to her own family, and here it took on a quality that several biographers have described as both impressive and unsettling. In the autumn of 1992, during what the Queen herself would later call her annus horribilis, 3 of her 4 children's marriages collapsed in public. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson separated in March. Anne divorced Mark Phillips in April. Charles and Diana's separation was announced in December. Throughout this sequence, according to Sally Bedell Smith's Elizabeth the Queen, monarch's outward composure never cracked. Staff at Balmoral during that summer reported that the Queen maintained her daily routine, the morning boxes, the afternoon walk with the corgis, the evening gin and dubonnet, with no visible alteration. When Princess Anne telephoned to discuss her divorce proceedings, the Queen listened, offered practical advice about the children, and ended the call. A lady-in-waiting present during the call told Bedell Smith that the Queen's voice remained completely even throughout. What was striking was not the composure itself, that was expected. What was striking was the effect it had on those around her. Her children, who had grown up with this absolute control, interpreted it differently from outsiders. To the public, it looked like strength. To her children, several sources suggest, it sometimes felt like absence. The most publicly visible test of this control came in September 1997, when Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in Paris. The Queen was at Balmoral with Prince William and Prince Harry when the news arrived in the early hours of August 31st. Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's Director of Communications, recorded in his published diaries that the Prime Minister telephoned Balmoral that morning and found the Queen focused entirely on the welfare of the boys. She did not discuss the public reaction. She did not discuss the press. When Campbell and Blair urged her to return to London, where public anger was building over the lack of a visible royal response, the Queen declined. She remained at Balmoral for 5 days. Robert Lacey, in Monarch, reports that during those 5 days, the Queen's household received an estimated 6,000 letters, many of them hostile. The tabloid press turned savage. The Daily Express ran the headline, "Show us you care." The Queen's response, when it finally came, a live television address on September the 5th, the evening before the funeral, was measured, precise, and delivered without a tremor in her voice. She called Diana an exceptional and gifted human being. The script, drafted by her Deputy Private Secretary Robin Janvrin, was edited personally by the Queen. She removed 3 adjectives and added 1 line, "Speaking as a grandmother." That edit, Lacey notes, was the closest she came to public emotion in 70 years on the throne. In June 2003, when President George W. Bush visited London amid massive protests against the Iraq War, the Queen hosted him at Buckingham Palace. Robert Hardman records that during the state banquet, protesters were audible from outside the palace windows. Bush, according to a diplomatic memo cited by Hardman, asked the Queen whether the noise bothered her. She replied, "I have been hearing that sound for 50 years, Mr. President. You get used to it." The remark was, on its surface, a reassurance, but several American diplomats present interpreted it differently. One told Hardman, "It was the most elegant way of telling someone their problems are temporary that I have ever heard." The Queen was not offering sympathy. She was offering perspective. And the perspective contained a quiet judgment about the transience of political crises compared to the permanence of the institution she represented. Bush, to his credit, reportedly laughed. In 2005, during a reception at Buckingham Palace for the creative industries, the Queen was introduced to the guitarist Eric Clapton. According to an account Clapton later gave in a radio interview with BBC's Chris Evans, the Queen asked him whether he still played the guitar. Clapton, somewhat taken aback, confirmed that he did. The Queen said, "How lovely." There was a pause, then she moved on. Clapton told Evans he spent 3 days wondering whether the Queen had been genuinely interested, politely indifferent, or subtly devastating. He concluded he would never know. The ambiguity, he said, was the most royal thing about her. This small exchange captures something important. The Queen's restraint was not merely a defensive posture. It was a tool of social control that worked precisely because it could never be decoded with certainty. When a person never raises their voice, every slight modulation in tone carries enormous weight. A "how lovely" from someone who shouts would be background noise. A "how lovely" from Elizabeth II was an event that a world-famous musician analysed for 3 days. The private grief she carried was real, even when she refused to display it. In October 1966, a coal tip collapsed onto a school in the Welsh village of Aberfan, killing 144 people, 116 of them children. The Queen did not visit for 8 days. She later told Robert Lacey, in comments he published in Monarch, that the delay was her greatest regret as sovereign. She believed her presence would have been a distraction from the rescue effort. When she finally arrived, she walked through the wreckage with the bereaved parents. A local official told Lacey that the Queen's eyes were visibly red. She spoke to every family she met. She did not cry in public. A photographer captured an image of her face during the visit, her jaw set, her eyes wet, that became one of the most reproduced photographs of her reign. The restraint, in this case, was not absence. It was the opposite. She was holding herself together because she believed that falling apart in front of people who had lost their children would make their grief about her. The discipline cost her something. Lacey reports that she kept a photograph from Aberfan in her private study for the rest of her life. When Michael Fagan broke into Buckingham Palace on July 9, 1982, and entered the Queen's bedroom at approximately 7:15 in the morning, she was alone. Her bodyguard was off duty. Prince Philip was elsewhere in the palace. Fagan sat on the edge of her bed, holding a broken ashtray, and began talking. The Queen, according to the Metropolitan Police report and subsequent Home Office inquiry, did not scream, did not press the panic button immediately, and did not attempt to flee. She engaged Fagan in conversation for approximately 10 minutes, asking about his family and his circumstances, until a chambermaid arrived with her morning tea and the alarm was finally raised. Poor Wybrew, a footman, eventually entered and led Fagan away. Scotland Yard's internal review, made public years later, noted that the Queen's calm was instrumental in preventing the situation from escalating. Fagan himself, in a 2012 interview with The Independent, said she was just really nice. The detail that captures the full picture is what happened after Fagan was removed. The Queen got dressed, attended her scheduled engagements, and never publicly discussed the intrusion again. Her private secretary at the time, Sir William Heseltine, told Robert Hardman that she treated the episode as though someone had accidentally walked into the wrong room at a hotel. The one person who could break through the composure, according to multiple sources, was Prince Philip. Their marriage, which lasted 73 years from 1947 until Philip's death in April 2021, operated on terms that baffled outsiders. Philip shouted. He was blunt, impatient, and frequently volcanic in temperament. Robert Lacey records multiple incidents in which Philip raised his voice at staff, at diplomats, and at the Queen herself. At a Commonwealth reception in the late 1960s, documented by Giles Brandreth in his biography of Philip, The Duke loudly disagreed with the Queen's handling of a scheduling decision. She listened, said nothing, and continued with the original schedule. Philip, Brandreth writes, eventually stopped arguing, not because he had been persuaded, but because arguing with silence is exhausting. Yet their private dynamic was more complex than this suggests. Bedell Smith reports that the Queen once told a friend, "Philip is the only man in the world who treats me simply as a human being." The remark suggests that the composure she maintained with everyone else was, at some level, a burden. Philip's willingness to shout, to treat her as a wife rather than a sovereign, may have been the one relationship in which he could set down the weight of permanent self-control. What emerges from 70 years of evidence is not a portrait of coldness, though it was often mistaken for that. It is a portrait of a woman who understood, from the age of 10, that her emotions were not her own. Every monarch inherits this bargain to some degree, but Elizabeth II took it further than any of her predecessors. She did not merely suppress her feelings in public. She developed a system, the silences, the looks, the carefully calibrated phrases like, "How interesting," and "How lovely," that allowed her to exercise authority without ever appearing to exercise it. The constitutional position of the British monarch is advisory. The sovereign has the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. Elizabeth II understood that these rights were most powerful when exercised quietly. A warning delivered in a shout can be attributed to temper. A warning delivered in silence can only be attributed to judgment. The distinction matters because it determines whether the recipient can dismiss the message. You can dismiss anger. You cannot dismiss calm disapproval from someone who has been calm for 7 decades. Her critics, and she had them, particularly after the Diana crisis, argued that her restraint was a form of emotional cowardice, that she hid behind protocol to avoid genuine human connection. There is evidence that supports this reading, particularly in her relationships with her children. But there is equally strong evidence that the restraint was strategic, conscious, and maintained at significant personal cost. The Aberfan photograph. The 5 days at Balmoral after Diana's death, during which she was not ignoring public grief, but managing 2 grieving boys away from cameras. The 10 minutes of conversation with a disturbed intruder sitting on her bed. These are not the actions of a woman who feels nothing. They are the actions of a woman who decided, at a very young age, that what she felt was less important than what she did. If you have found value in this account, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and it ensures you see what comes next. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told, figures whose public image concealed a more complicated private reality. The bell notification means you will see them when they are published. The dishes at Balmoral are worth returning to. Every summer for decades, the Queen of England stood at a sink after a barbecue and washed the plates herself. The guests, prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, family members were expected to help. The rules were unspoken but absolute. Margaret Thatcher brought a skirt suit. The Queen brought Wellington boots. The moment at the sink was not about dishes. It was about who understood the room and who did not. Elizabeth II spent 70 years communicating in exactly this way, through what she did not say, through what she did not do, through silences that lasted 3 seconds or 5 days, through phrases so mild they took seasoned diplomats and rock musicians days to decode. She never raised her voice. That was the warning. Because the people who needed to understand her understood that when Elizabeth II said nothing, she was saying everything. and by the time you realized you had been corrected, the conversation was already over.